My name is June Hall. I'm 34 years old, and for the past decade, I've worked in corporate operations, one of those quiet departments most people barely notice unless something goes wrong. I live in Seattle, in a small apartment with more books than furniture and a habit of making tea before every difficult decision. My life, at least on the surface, has always been steady, predictable, responsible in a kind of way that doesn't attract attention. At work, people usually describe me using words that sound polite, but also strangely small: reliable, quiet, low maintenance, easy to work with. What those words often mean in practice is something else entirely. They mean people assume you won't push back. They mean your calmness is mistaken for passivity. Your patience becomes permission. Your silence becomes a convenient place for other people to hide their mistakes. For most of my career, I didn't mind that role. Being underestimated can feel peaceful at first. When people aren't watching you closely, you're free to do your job without constant scrutiny. You become the person who keeps systems running, who remembers details others forget, who quietly fixes problems before they escalate. But there's a strange line between being trusted and being used, and sometimes that line moves without you noticing. The story I'm about to tell started with something small, not dramatic, not explosive, just a moment that could have easily been dismissed as office politics, the kind of thing most people roll their eyes at and move on from. My coworker sent a fake complaint to HR using my name. At first glance, the message looked convincing: formal language, correct formatting, even details about projects I had worked on. But there was one problem. HR noticed that I was actually sitting in a meeting at the exact time the email was sent. That tiny detail, the timestamp of a meeting room calendar, became the thread that slowly unraveled something much larger than a single email. This isn't a story about revenge. I didn't yell. I didn't sabotage anyone. There was no dramatic confrontation in a conference room. What happened instead unfolded quietly, over weeks and months, in ways that most people in the office didn't even recognize until it was already too late to change anything. If you've ever been the person in a room who speaks less but notices more, if you've ever felt the strange experience of being both essential and invisible at the same time, then you might understand why this story matters to me. Because sometimes the most important turning points in our lives don't begin with anger. They begin with a single moment where you realize something simple: you've been paying attention the entire time, even when everyone else assumed you weren't. Before we get into what happened that day and what followed afterward, there's something you should understand about the person I was back then. Because the version of me my coworkers thought they knew wasn't the whole story. But before I continue, I'm curious about something. Have you ever been underestimated in a way that people didn't realize might eventually matter? If you had asked anyone in my office who June Hall was 2 years ago, the answers would have been remarkably consistent. She's the organized one. She handles operations. She's quiet. That last word was always delivered with a small pause, like people were trying to decide whether it was a compliment or a flaw. In a company full of consultants, people trained to talk, persuade, present, and dominate meetings, quietness is an unusual trait. Most voices in our office competed for attention. Mine didn't. I sat at the long conference table during weekly operations meetings, usually 3 seats from the end, close enough to follow every conversation, far enough that no one expected me to lead it. My role was simple, at least on paper. I coordinated schedules across departments. I tracked project milestones. I ensured documentation was consistent for clients and internal teams. In reality, my job was something less visible, but more essential. I noticed things. When consultants promised deadlines they couldn't meet. When finance approved budgets that didn't match project scopes. When two departments thought someone else was responsible for the same task. None of this was dramatic work, but without someone quietly keeping track of these moving parts, the entire system would begin to drift, and drifting systems eventually fail. My coworkers appreciated that, in a distant way. The way people appreciate the quiet hum of electricity in a building. You don't notice it when everything works, but you panic when it stops. One person in particular embodied that attitude more than anyone else: Daniel Mercer. Daniel was a senior consultant in our strategy division, charismatic, confident, the kind of person who could walk into a meeting and instantly take control of the room. He spoke quickly, he moved quickly, and most importantly, he believed quickness was the same thing as competence. In meetings, Daniel often treated operational details like background noise, which meant he treated me like background noise. June will handle the logistics, he'd say, waving a hand casually when scheduling questions came up, or, operations can clean that up later. I don't think he meant it as an insult. To Daniel, people existed in categories: visionaries, leaders, support roles, and in his mind, I fit neatly into the last category, the reliable one, the quiet one, the person who would stay late updating spreadsheets while others celebrated landing new clients. For a long time, I accepted that perception without argument. There's a strange comfort in invisibility. When people underestimate you, expectations stay low, pressure stays manageable. But invisibility has another side. It means people begin to assume you don't notice things. They assume you're not paying attention to the tone behind their comments. They assume you won't remember small moments that felt insignificant to them. Moments like the first time Daniel interrupted me in a meeting mid-sentence, or the second time he corrected information that I had already verified, confidently, incorrectly, or the third time he used my work in a presentation without mentioning where it came from. None of these moments was explosive. No one raised their voice. No one called anyone out. But small things accumulate, like tiny scratches in glass. Individually, they're invisible. Together, they change how the entire surface reflects light. Looking back now, I realize something important about that period of my life. The version of June Hall that existed in my coworkers' minds was incomplete. They saw someone quiet, someone complies, someone who wouldn't challenge them. What they didn't see was something much simpler. I remembered everything, every meeting, every promise, every timeline, and I wrote most of it down in the Navy notebook that rarely left my desk. At the time, those notes were just part of how I worked. Documentation, organization, professional habit. I didn't realize yet that one day, those quiet records would become the difference between someone else's story about me and the truth. And the first crack in that story appeared during a meeting that most people in the room forgot within an hour. But I didn't, because that was the moment when something small happened, something almost invisible to everyone else. The first small cut didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no moment where the entire room suddenly went silent. In fact, if you asked most of the people present that day, they probably wouldn't remember it at all. It happened on a Tuesday morning during our weekly cross-department planning meeting, the kind of meeting that appears on calendars every week until the end of time. 10 people in a glass conference room, laptops open, coffee cups are half empty. Someone was quietly typing while someone else presented slides, which no one had time to fully read. I was there, as usual, 3 seats from the end of the table. My Navy notebook sat open beside my laptop, pen resting across the page. The meeting was led by Daniel Mercer. He stood near the screen at the front of the room, walking everyone through timelines for a new client project, a large logistics company that had just signed a consulting contract with us. It was an ambitious project, tight deadlines, multiple departments involved, which meant, naturally, operations had already spent several days mapping out the scheduling realities, including me. Halfway through Daniel's presentation, a slide appeared listing the rollout schedule. Week 1, data intake. Week 2, analysis phase. Week 3, client workshop. Week 4, implementation. As soon as I saw the timeline, something felt wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just off. I flipped back 2 pages in my notebook, where I had written the confirmed availability of the analytics team. Their lead specialist was on leave during week 2, which meant the schedule Daniel was presenting simply couldn't work. In most meetings, moments like that pass quietly. People notice problems but assume someone else will say something. I raised my hand slightly, not in a formal way, just enough to signal I had a quick note. Daniel, I said, keeping my voice calm, I think week 2 might conflict with the analytics team's availability. Karen mentioned she'll be out that week. He paused. Not a long pause, just long enough to glance at the slide again. Then he gave a small smile, the kind of people use when they think they're correcting something trivial. No, that shouldn't be an issue, he said. I checked with them earlier. Several people nodded automatically. Meetings move quickly. Confidence often replaces verification. I opened my notebook and turned it toward him slightly. Karen emailed operations last Thursday confirming her leave dates, I said. She's out from the 10th through the 16th. Daniel didn't look at the notebook. Instead, he gave a small dismissive laugh. "I'm sure we'll work it out," he said, already clicking to the next slide. And that was it. The conversation moved on. No confrontation, no tension, just the quiet message that my input wasn't necessary. Most people in the room probably didn't even register the exchange. But I did, because about 15 minutes later, something interesting happened. Someone else spoke up. Mark from finance. "Wait," he said, looking at the schedule again. "Isn't Karen out that week?" The room paused. Daniel frowned slightly, glancing at the slide. "Oh," he said after a moment. "Right, that might be true." He turned to the screen. "Good catch, Mark. We'll shift that timeline." There was a brief murmur of agreement. A few keyboards tapped as people updated their notes. And then the meeting continued. No one looked at me. No one mentioned that the exact same point had already been raised earlier. By me. Again, it wasn't dramatic. No one intentionally ignored me. But something about the moment stayed with me. Not because Daniel had dismissed my comment. That kind of thing happens in meetings all the time. What stayed with me was something quieter. The room had accepted the same information differently depending on who said it. When I said it, it was a suggestion. When Mark said it, it was a correction. And I remember sitting there, pen resting on the page of my notebook, realizing something small but important. Perception in an office doesn't form through big events. It forms through dozens of tiny moments like that one. Moments where people decide, often unconsciously, whose voice carries weight and who doesn't. That meeting ended the way most meetings do. People packed their laptops, chairs scraped lightly across the floor. Conversation shifted toward lunch plans and client calls. Daniel walked out with two consultants discussing strategy ideas. Mark left with finance spreadsheets under his arm. I closed my notebook and slipped the pen into the spiral binding. Before leaving the room, I wrote one more small line beneath the meeting notes. Not a complaint, just an observation. Timeline conflict raised, ignored. At the time, I didn't think of it as evidence. It was simply a habit. Recording details, tracking decisions, but looking back now, I can see that moment for what it really was. Not an insult, not even intentional disrespect, just the beginning of something subtle, a pattern. And like most patterns, it didn't appear only once. It repeated, slowly, quietly, over the next several months, until eventually, I even started to question whether speaking up was worth it at all. After the meeting where Mark repeated the exact point I had already raised, something small shifted in the way I approach conversations at work. Not dramatically. I still attended the same meetings. I still tracked timelines and corrected documentation. I still kept my Navy notebook open beside my laptop. But I noticed something about how people responded to information depending on who delivered it. And once you see a pattern like that, it's very difficult to unsee it. Over the next few months, the same dynamic repeated itself in subtle ways. Sometimes it happened in meetings, sometimes in email threads, sometimes in casual conversations near the coffee machine. A consultant would ask a question about a deadline. I would answer it calmly and clearly. The conversation would continue as if the question were still unresolved. Then 5 minutes later, someone else would say almost the same thing. And suddenly the answer would stick. It wasn't malicious. That's the strange part. No one in the office seemed aware it was happening. People simply trusted certain voices more than others. Daniel Mercer's voice was one of those voices. He had the kind of confidence that makes statements sound correct even before they're verified. Clients liked him. Leadership liked him. He delivered presentations with sharp slides and quick conclusions, and in the ecosystem of our office, that kind of confidence carried weight. Meanwhile, operations, the department I worked in, was built around quiet accuracy. We didn't make bold claims, we tracked facts, which meant our contributions often arrived without the dramatic tone people subconsciously listen to. At first, I responded the way most people do when faced with subtle dismissal. I rationalized it. It's just a busy meeting. People didn't hear me. Daniel's under pressure. That last one became my favorite explanation. Consultants like Daniel work directly with clients. They faced deadlines, expectations, and revenue targets. Operations worked behind the scenes. So when small moments of dismissal happened, it felt easier to excuse them as stress. There was another reason I stayed quiet. I had spent most of my professional life avoiding unnecessary conflict. Not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because I had learned something early in my career. When a quiet person suddenly pushes back, People rarely ask why. They simply decide the quiet person has become difficult. And once that label appears, it spreads quickly. So I did what many people in support roles do. I adapt. If someone interrupted me mid-sentence, I let them finish. If someone repeated my point as their own, I didn't correct them. If a meeting moved forward with inaccurate assumptions, I documented the details and prepared the corrections afterward. From the outside, it probably looked like patience or professionalism. But internally, something else was happening. I was learning the structure of the room. Who listened to whom? Whose opinions were trusted without question? Who needed evidence before accepting a correction? Daniel, for example, rarely changed course in the moment. If you contradicted him directly in a meeting, he treated it like a challenge. But if the same information appeared later, structured, documented, calmly presented, he accepted it without resistance. Once I understood that pattern, I adjusted my timing. I stopped trying to correct things immediately. Instead, I waited. I would send follow-up summaries after meetings, attaching timelines and references. No accusations, no commentary, just information. Gradually, something interesting started to happen. People began relying on those summaries. Managers forwarded them. Project leads referenced them. Even Daniel occasionally replied with a simple line, "Thanks for documenting this, June," which meant the system was working. But the underlying dynamic hadn't changed. In conversations, my voice still carried less weight than others. In the documentation, my work carried more. It was an odd imbalance, and I accepted it. Until one afternoon, when something happened that made me realize the situation wasn't as harmless as I had been telling myself. It happened during a client preparation meeting, a discussion about deliverables for a major account. Daniel was leading the conversation again. At one point, he referenced a report, an operational analysis I had spent nearly 2 weeks compiling. Charts, data validation, process breakdowns. But when he introduced the report to the room, he said something that made me pause. This analysis came out of the strategy team. Not operations, strategy. I looked up from my notebook. For a moment, I thought he might correct himself. Sometimes people misspeak, but the meeting continued. No correction, no acknowledgement, just the quiet transfer of ownership from the person who built the work to the department presenting it. Again, it wasn't dramatic. No one in the room knew the difference. But as I sat there listening to the discussion continue, I felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not even frustration, just a quiet realization. The pattern I had been observing for months wasn't just about people talking over each other in meetings. It was about something deeper: credit, responsibility, ownership. And if those things could shift unnoticed during small moments, then they could shift during larger ones too. At the time, I still believed the situation could be solved with better communication, better documentation, better clarity. What I didn't realize yet was that the office had already assigned me a role, and the more reliable I became inside that role, the harder it would be for anyone to imagine me stepping outside of it. Every workplace has roles that exist beyond official job titles. They're not written in contracts. They don't appear in performance reviews, but everyone in the room understands them anyway. There's the person who always leads discussions, the one who cracks jokes when meetings get tense, the one who challenges ideas just to test them. And then there's the person who quietly makes everything work. That was the role the office had assigned to me, not formally, but consistently. If a project timeline collapsed, someone would say, "June can help reorganize it." If departments misunderstood each other, someone would say, "Let's loop June in." If documentation needed to be rebuilt after a rushed presentation, someone would forward the work to my inbox with a short message: "Can you clean this up?" Over time, I noticed something interesting. People didn't ask whether I should handle these things. They assumed I would, because I always had. And to be fair, there was a reason for that. I was good at it. I liked systems, I liked clarity. I liked taking messy information and turning it into something structured and reliable. So when tasks landed on my desk that technically belonged to someone else, my instinct was simple: fix the problem, move forward. But habits like that have an unintended side effect. They train people to rely on you without noticing the cost. One Thursday afternoon, I experienced a perfect example of that. I had just returned from lunch when I found 3 new emails marked urgent, all from Daniel. The subject lines were variations of the same phrase: "Quick favor." The first message asked if I could reformat a client presentation. The second asked if I could double-check data sources. The third asked if I could quickly review a contract appendix before the end of the day. None of those tasks technically belonged to operations, but none of them were unusual either. Daniel often moved quickly, producing materials right before client meetings, and when details needed to be verified, operations became the safety net. I opened the presentation first. Within 5 minutes, I realized something important. Sen, the data charts inside it had been built using an outdated version of the analysis I had completed 2 weeks earlier, which meant the numbers Daniel planned to show the client were already inaccurate. I sent him a short message. Daniel, the dataset in slide 8 is from the previous revision. I'll update it using the current file. His reply came quickly. Perfect! Knew you'd catch it. I stared at that line for a moment, not because it was rude, but because it was revealing. Knew you'd catch it, which meant something subtle. Daniel hadn't been worried about the mistake. He had assumed someone else would fix it. Someone like me. And in that moment, sitting at my desk with the afternoon light coming through the office windows, I realized something that had been quietly forming in my mind for months. The office didn't just see me as reliable, they saw me as inevitable. If something went wrong, June would notice. If something needed correcting, June would handle it. If details were missing, June would fill them in. And the more consistently I fulfilled that role, the less visible the effort behind it became. Reliability has a strange effect on perception. When you succeed once, people say thank you. When you succeed every time, people stop noticing the effort entirely. That afternoon, I updated Daniel's presentation, corrected the data charts, and verified the appendix he had sent earlier. The tasks took nearly 2 hours. When I finished, I sent the revised files back with a simple note explaining the corrections. His response came 5 minutes later. Great, thanks. No acknowledgement of the original mistake. No recognition that the presentation would have contained incorrect information without the update. Just gratitude for the fix. Again, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even unfair by most corporate standards, but it confirmed something I had been slowly understanding. The role I had been assigned in that office was not just supportive. It was invisible infrastructure, like the wiring behind walls, essential, but only noticed when it failed. For a long time, I accepted that role. It allowed me to work calmly, without constant attention. But something about that Thursday afternoon stayed with me. Not because of the workload, not because of Daniel, but because of the realization it brought with it. If people had begun to see my reliability as something automatic, then they had also begun to assume something else. My patience had no limit, and assumptions like that tend to last, right up until the moment they quietly stop being true. That moment arrived a few weeks later. Not during a meeting, not during a project crisis, just a small, ordinary moment at the end of a long workday. But it was the moment when something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, just enough to change the direction of everything that came afterward. The day something shifted didn't start with conflict. It wasn't a crisis day. No urgent meetings, no angry emails. It was one of those quiet midweek afternoons when the office felt slightly slower than usual. Half the consultants were traveling. A few desks were empty. The usual hum of conversations had softened into scattered keyboard clicks and distant phone calls. I was reviewing documentation for a logistics project when an internal message popped up on my screen. It was from Daniel. Quick thing, can you jump into conference room B for a minute? That wasn't unusual. Operations often got pulled into quick discussions when details needed clarification. So I grabbed my notebook and walked down the hallway. Conference room B was one of the smaller meeting spaces. Glass walls, a round table, whiteboard still covered in half-erased notes from a previous team. Daniel was already inside, standing near the screen with 2 other consultants. When I walked in, he gave a quick nod. Hey, June, quick question, he said. He pulled up a slide on the screen. It was another timeline, this time for a client implementation phase. I glanced at it for a few seconds. Something about it felt familiar. Then I realized why. It was my timeline, not inspired by it, not loosely based on it. Exactly my timeline. The same structure, the same phases, even the same formatting style I used in internal documents. But there was one difference. At the bottom of the slide, under Prepared By, it said Strategy Division, Daniel Mercer. For a moment, the room felt very quiet. Daniel continued speaking casually, pointing at different parts of the schedule. "We're presenting this to the client tomorrow," he said. "Just wanted to confirm the rollout sequence makes sense operationally." The two consultants beside him watched the screen. Neither of them knew where the timeline originally came from. To them, it probably looked like any other strategy document. I looked at the slide again. It was the version I had built 3 weeks earlier during the project planning phase. The same one I had sent to Daniel when he asked for operational guidance, which meant something simple. The document on the screen wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a transfer. My work had quietly become someone else's presentation material, and for the first time, the pattern I had been observing for months stopped feeling abstract. It became clear. Daniel finished explaining the slide and looked toward me. "So," he said casually, "anything we should tweak?" His tone was relaxed, efficient, as if I were simply reviewing a document that had appeared naturally from his department. The other consultants looked at me too, waiting. I felt the familiar instinct to do what I always did: fix the details, improve the structure, make sure the client presentation succeeded. But something inside me paused. Not anger, not resentment, just a quiet moment of clarity. Because this wasn't the first time work had shifted ownership. It was just the first time I had seen it happen this directly. I could have said something in that moment. I could have pointed at the slide and said, "I built that timeline," but I didn't. Not because I was afraid, because something about the situation suddenly felt instructive. If I corrected Daniel right there in the room, one of two things would happen. Either he would apologize and move on, or he would explain that the timeline had been collaborative input. In either case, the moment would pass. Nothing would actually change. So instead, I did something simpler. I reviewed the slide calmly. "The rollout sequence is correct," I said, "but the analytics phase should start 2 days earlier. Otherwise, the implementation team won't have enough preparation time." Daniel nodded immediately. "Good catch." He adjusted the timeline while I watched. The correction I had suggested was saved under his presentation. Then the meeting ended. The consultants left the room discussing tomorrow's client call. Daniel packed up his laptop. "Appreciate the help," he said casually as he walked past me toward the door, and just like that, the moment ended. From the outside, nothing unusual had happened. But as I walked back to my desk, notebook still in my hand, I realized something had quietly changed. Not in the office, in me. For months, I had been observing patterns of dismissal and misplaced credit. Up until that day, I had treated them like small inconveniences, things that could be managed with patience. But that afternoon, I saw the situation differently. Because patterns don't exist by accident. They exist because a system allows them to. And if the system remains unchanged, the pattern continues. When I sat down at my desk again, I opened my Navy notebook. I turned to a new page. At the top, I wrote a single line: strategy timeline, originally created for logistics project. Then I closed the notebook. Not as evidence, not yet, just a record. Because that was the day something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly enough that no one else in the office noticed. My silence was no longer just patience. It had become something else, something deliberate. After the meeting in conference room B, something about my behavior at work began to change. Not in a way anyone else could immediately identify. I still arrived at the office around the same time every morning. I still attended the same meetings. I still completed the same responsibilities, but internally, my approach to the environment around me shifted. Before that day, my silence had mostly been instinct, a professional habit built from years of avoiding unnecessary conflict. Now it has become something else, a choice. And when silence becomes intentional, it changes the way you observe the world around you. You start listening more carefully. You start noticing who speaks confidently even when they're uncertain, who hesitates before presenting an idea, who repeats someone else's point without realizing it. It's remarkable how much information becomes visible when you stop trying to immediately correct everything. Over the following weeks, I spoke slightly less during meetings, not dramatically less, just enough that people stopped expecting input from me unless it was specifically requested, which, interestingly, made them more comfortable. There's a strange psychology in corporate environments. Confident personalities often prefer quiet colleagues, not because they dislike them, but because silence leaves space, and space allows louder voices to expand. Daniel Mercer, in particular, seemed completely comfortable with the dynamic. He continued leading strategy meetings the same way he always had: fast explanations, confident conclusions, occasional requests for operational confirmation, and when those requests appeared, I responded calmly, just as before. But there was one small difference. I no longer rushed to correct things immediately. If a timeline looked unrealistic, I noted it. If a dataset seemed incomplete, I recorded the reference. If a presentation included work I recognized as mine, I observed how it was introduced. The notebook I carried had always been part of my workflow, but now it has become something more structured. Instead of simply documenting meetings, I started organizing patterns: dates, decisions, who presented what information, which departments originally produced it. It wasn't a formal system, just careful observation. Meanwhile, something interesting happened within the office dynamic, because when you stop interrupting patterns, they often grow more visible. Daniel's confidence became slightly more pronounced. The strategy team began presenting operational structures more frequently. In meetings, I noticed my name was mentioned less often, but my work appeared more frequently in documentation coming from other departments. Again, none of this looked dramatic from the outside. Corporate environments are full of overlapping contributions. Ideas move between teams all the time, but patterns leave traces. And I was quietly collecting them. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the meeting in conference room B, I experienced a moment that confirmed how comfortable everyone had become with the existing arrangement. I was sitting at my desk when an email thread began circulating through several departments. The subject line read, "Client Escalation, Timeline Issue." When I opened it, I immediately recognized the project. It was the logistics implementation plan Daniel had presented to the client. The same timeline we had reviewed in the conference room, except now the client had discovered something. The schedule Daniel presented didn't match the operational constraints we had originally discussed, specifically, the analytics team's availability, the issue I had raised weeks earlier, and corrected inside the presentation. But apparently, the version delivered to the client had reverted to the earlier timeline, which meant the error had resurfaced. The email chain quickly filled with messages: consultants discussing possible adjustments, managers are asking how the timeline discrepancy occurred. Eventually, someone asked a question that made the thread pause. Operations. Can you confirm the correct schedule? Several people responded with the same phrase. Let's ask June. I stared at the screen for a moment, because that single sentence revealed something important. Even though my voice carried less weight in meetings, even though my work sometimes appeared under different names, when something actually went wrong, people still expected the answer to come from the same place: me, the quiet infrastructure behind the process. I replied with a short, factual message. Attach the correct operational timeline. Reference the original planning document. No commentary, no blame, just information. Within minutes, the thread shifted. Thanks, June. Good clarification. Let's update the client. The issue resolved itself quickly, but as I closed the email window, I realized something that had slowly become obvious. The office believed two things at the same time. They believed strategy led the work, and they believed operations would fix the consequences. And for a long time, I had allowed that balance to continue. But after the shift I experienced in conference room B, after weeks of watching the patterns become clearer, my silence was no longer passive. It had become observational, strategic, because there was one thing about the system that no one else seemed to notice. It relied heavily on information, accurate information. And information leaves trails: email timestamps, document histories, meeting schedules. Little digital fingerprints are scattered across systems that most people never examine closely. For someone who worked in operations, those trails were easy to see. And the more I paid attention to them, the more I began to understand something quietly powerful. There were things happening inside the company that people assumed no one was tracking carefully. But I was. Not because I planned to use that knowledge, at least not at first, but understanding a system completely sometimes requires stepping back long enough to watch it operate without interference. And while everyone else moved quickly through meetings and presentations, there were patterns forming quietly beneath the surface. Patterns that would eventually reveal something no one in the office expected, including me. Once I stopped trying to correct every small mistake in real time, something surprising happened. My work actually became easier, not lighter in terms of workload. Operations rarely become lighter, but clearer in terms of perspective. Because when you're no longer reacting to every moment as it happens, you begin to see the larger structure behind it. The office, for example, had rhythms. Mondays were strategy heavy. Tuesdays are filled with planning calls. Wednesdays often brought client updates. By Thursday afternoon, people were usually tired enough that details started slipping through conversations. And Friday mornings were when documentation finally caught up with everything that had been said earlier in the week. For years, I had worked inside those rhythms without thinking about them. Now I watch them. Quietly, the notebook I carried began filling with a slightly different kind of information, still meeting notes, still project timelines, but also observations about how decisions actually traveled through the company. Who introduced the idea? Who repeated it later in a meeting? Who received credit when that idea eventually became part of a presentation? The interesting thing about patterns is that once you recognize them, they begin appearing everywhere. Take Daniel, for example. He wasn't stealing work in the dramatic sense people imagine. There was no moment when he deliberately erased someone's name from a document. Instead, it happened in smaller steps. Someone in operations would create a planning framework. Daniel would reference it while preparing a client presentation. By the time the presentation reached the meeting room, the framework looked like a strategy deliverable. Not because Daniel had consciously claimed ownership, but because that's how information naturally reorganizes itself around confident voices. For a while, I simply observed. But then something happened that made observation feel slightly more important. One afternoon, while updating project documentation, I opened a shared folder that contained multiple versions of a strategy presentation. Most of the files were routine revisions, but one detail caught my attention: the document history. Every corporate file system keeps track of who created and edited documents. Usually, no one checks those histories unless something breaks. But operations deal with processes, and processes often require verification. So I clicked on the History tab, and there it was, a quiet timeline of contributions. The original operational framework was created under my name, downloaded, re-uploaded into a strategy folder, edited, reformatted, presented. Again, it wasn't dramatic, no rules had technically been broken. Ideas move between departments all the time. But the pattern became very clear once you looked at the timeline carefully. Operations created the infrastructure, strategy repackaged it, clients saw the final version. Most companies operate this way to some degree. But what made this particular situation unusual was how consistently it involved the same person, Daniel. Over the next few weeks, I began paying slightly closer attention to documentation trails. Nothing invasive, just the normal level of verification someone in operations might perform when ensuring project materials are aligned. Document timestamps, email attachments, meeting summaries. Every now and then I would notice a small detail. A planning chart originally sent from operations appeared later in a strategy proposal. A project outline shifting departments between drafts. None of it looked suspicious on the surface, but the patterns were consistent, and consistency creates clarity. Meanwhile, in the visible part of the office, everything continued exactly as it always had. Meetings, client calls, presentations. Daniel remained confident and well-liked. My role remained quiet and reliable. If anyone had asked, they would have said the company was functioning normally. But there was one thing no one seemed to notice. Information systems remember things people forget. Emails remember who sent the first draft. Calendars remember who attended which meeting. File histories remember who created the original document. Most people never examine those records, not because they're hidden, but because they assume there's no reason to. Operations, however, is built on a different assumption. If something eventually goes wrong, the fastest way to fix it is to know exactly how it happened, which means knowing where to look. One evening, as I prepared to leave the office, I reviewed the notes I had been collecting over the past few months. Not evidence, just observations, dates, documents, timelines. When I looked at the pages together, something interesting appeared. Not a single dramatic incident, but a sequence of small shifts in ownership and attribution. Almost like watching a river slowly change direction over time. I closed the notebook and slipped it into my bag. At that point, I still didn't have a plan. I wasn't preparing for confrontation. I wasn't collecting proof for some dramatic moment. I was simply understanding the system I worked in. But the more clearly I understood it, the more I realized something. There were aspects of that system that most people in the office had never considered, not because they were secret, because they were boring, technical, administrative, the kinds of details people assume someone else is quietly handling. Someone like me. And buried inside those boring administrative details, there were a few things that, if examined closely enough, could reveal something unexpected. Something even Daniel hadn't noticed. Not yet. The moment of clarity didn't arrive during a meeting. It didn't happen in a tense conversation or a dramatic discovery. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon while I was doing something incredibly routine. Auditing project documentation. Operations performs small internal reviews every quarter. Nothing aggressive, just a process to make sure client deliverables, internal notes, and project records all align properly. Usually it's boring work. You open files, check timestamps, confirm versions, and move on. Most people rush through it, but I've always approached audits differently. Documentation is like a timeline, and timelines, if you read them carefully enough, tell stories. That afternoon, I was reviewing files connected to the logistics project, the same one that had caused the earlier timeline confusion. I opened the strategy folder first. Several presentations sat inside it: client briefings, internal updates, planning frameworks. One file caught my attention immediately: the presentation Daniel had used during the client rollout discussion. I wasn't looking for anything unusual, but when I opened the document history, something made me pause. The timestamp for the first version, not the version Daniel edited, the original uploaded file, and the name attached to it. It wasn't Daniel. It wasn't anyone from strategy. It was me, which meant the file hadn't simply been inspired by the operational framework I created. It had been built directly from the file I sent earlier. That wasn't surprising. People reuse internals documents all the time, but then I noticed something else. The time of the upload, 10:42 a.m., and suddenly a small memory surfaced. That exact time felt familiar. I turned to my notebook and flipped back through several pages. Eventually, I found the date. Next to the meeting notes from that morning, I had written a short line: Executive Review, Conference Room A. I remembered that meeting clearly because it had run longer than expected. I had been inside the room with 3 managers and HR for almost 2 hours, which meant something simple. At 10:42 a.m., when the strategy presentation was first uploaded under my name, I wasn't at my desk. I was sitting in a meeting across the building. For a moment, I assumed it was a technical detail. Maybe the file had been copied from a shared folder. Maybe the system automatically carried my name from the original document. But curiosity has a way of asking quiet follow-up questions. So I checked something else. The email history is attached to that file. And that's when I saw the message. A short internal complaint was sent to HR. The subject line mentioned my name. The content suggested I had submitted misleading operational documentation. At first glance, it looked convincing. Professional tone, clear formatting. Even the file attachment appeared legitimate. But one detail quietly unraveled the entire story. The timestamp. The complaint email had been sent at 10:42 a.m. At the same moment, the file appeared in the strategy folder under my name, which created a problem, because HR already had the attendance record from the executive review meeting, the meeting I had been physically sitting in at that exact time. Meaning something obvious, I couldn't have sent the email. I leaned back slightly in my chair, not shocked, just thoughtful, because the more I looked at the situation, the clearer the structure became. Someone had attempted to create the appearance that I submitted incorrect documentation. The complaint had been carefully written. The supporting file had been positioned inside the system. If no one checked the details too closely, the situation might have looked like a simple operational mistake. But digital systems remember more than people expect. Calendar attendance, meeting logs, file access records, all quietly confirming something simple. At the exact moment the complaint was sent in my name, I had been sitting in a room full of witnesses, which meant the complaint hadn't just been false, it had been impossible. I closed the document history window and stared at the screen for a moment. Still calm, still quiet, but now with a very clear understanding of something I hadn't realized before. The patterns I had been observing for months weren't just about credit shifting between departments. They were about responsibility shifting, too. And someone had just tried to move a very specific responsibility in my direction. except that the timing had created a small problem, one that no one in the office had noticed yet, not even the person who sent the complaint, because whoever wrote that email had assumed something very simple, that no one would bother checking the exact minute it was sent, but operations live in minutes, in timestamps, in the quiet details people overlook. So I closed the file, closed the email history, and wrote a single line in my notebook. Complaint email, sent while I was in an executive meeting. No reaction, no announcement, just documentation. Because at that moment, I understood something clearly. The situation had moved beyond quiet observation. Someone had taken a step, and steps like that always lead somewhere. The only question was how far the path would go before anyone else noticed it. The interesting thing about discovering leverage is that the discovery itself rarely feels dramatic. Movies make it look like a moment of triumph. In reality, it feels more like sitting quietly with information and realizing that the next decision matters more than the discovery. That afternoon, after noticing the timestamp conflict between the complaint email and the executive meeting I had attended, I didn't immediately contact HR. I didn't forward the email. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I closed the files and went back to work. Because when you work in operations long enough, you learn something important. The first reaction is rarely the most effective one. Information has a way of becoming more powerful when it's allowed to sit for a moment. Not hidden, just unannounced. That evening, after the office had mostly emptied, I stayed at my desk a little longer than usual. Not because I was investigating, but I wanted to understand the situation clearly before taking any step at all. There were several options in front of me. The first option was the most obvious. I could email HR directly, attach the meeting attendance record, point out that the complaint email had been sent while I was physically present in a different room. That approach would probably resolve the misunderstanding quickly. HR would realize the complaint was false. The situation would close, but something about that option felt incomplete. Because while it would clear my name, it wouldn't explain why the complaint existed in the first place. The second option was more direct. I could walk down the hallway the next morning and ask Daniel a simple question. Did you send a complaint to HR using my name? It would be a very short conversation, but confrontations like that rarely produce honest answers. People defend themselves instinctively when they feel accused. The conversation would turn into explanations, confusion, maybe even denial, and again the underlying pattern would remain hidden. The third option was quieter. I could do nothing, at least for now, because something about the timing of the email created a natural safeguard. HR had already seen the timestamp. They had already seen the meeting record, which meant someone inside that department likely understood the contradiction already. If they investigated further, they would eventually notice the same details I had seen. The complaint would collapse on its own. But waiting also had another advantage. It allowed the situation to reveal more information. False complaints rarely exist in isolation. They tend to appear when someone believes they're protecting something else, a mistake, a reputation, a decision that might not hold up under closer examination. So instead of reacting immediately, I chose the option that felt the most aligned with the approach I had been quietly developing over the past several months. Observation, patience, clarity. Before leaving the office that evening, I opened my notebook one more time. I reviewed the earlier pages. The timeline presentation had shifted ownership. The meetings where operational corrections had been dismissed. The patterns of documentation moving between departments. And now this. A complaint submitted under my name at a time when I couldn't possibly have written it. None of those moments looked dramatic individually, but when placed together, they formed something else. A sequence, a story about how responsibility and credit moved inside the office, and more importantly, about who controlled that movement. I closed the notebook and slipped it into my bag. Then I turned off my desk light and walked toward the elevator. As I left the building, the city outside was already dark. Seattle evenings in early spring always feel quiet. Street lights reflecting off wet pavement. Coffee shops are still glowing softly through their windows. During the walk home, I thought about the options again. The truth was, the decision I had made wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about timing. Because if someone had attempted to use my name in a complaint, then they had already taken a step much larger than the small patterns I had been observing earlier. And steps like that tend to create consequences. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but always eventually. By the time I reached my apartment building, my mind had settled on something simple. I wasn't going to chase the situation. I was going to let it move. Because systems reveal themselves most clearly when people assume no one is paying attention. And right now, the person who sent that complaint believed exactly that. They believed the email had done its job. They believed the story they created might quietly settle into the background. They believed no one would examine the details closely enough to notice the flaw. What they didn't realize was that the flaw had already been noticed. Quietly, carefully. And once something like that becomes visible, it changes the balance of an entire situation. Not immediately, but inevitably. After I made the decision, nothing changed on the surface. I still arrived at the office at 8:45 every morning. I still carried my notebook into meetings. I still listened more than I spoke. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed something different. But no one was watching closely. That had always been the advantage. The first step wasn't dramatic, it was administrative. I sent a short email to HR asking for clarification about internal communication policies, specifically about impersonation, falsified complaints, and the misuse of employee identities. The message was neutral, professional, almost boring, but it created a record. And in corporate environments, records matter more than emotions. At the same time, I began organizing everything I had quietly documented over the past few weeks. Meeting logs, calendar timestamps, email headers, internal chat records. Nothing about it felt like revenge. It felt more like preparing a timeline. When you work in operations long enough, you learn something important. Problems rarely collapse from a single moment. They collapse from patterns, and patterns become clear when someone finally arranges the details in the right order. I also scheduled a private meeting with a senior compliance officer, not to accuse anyone, just to ask a question. What normally happens, I asked calmly, if an employee sends an HR complaint from someone else's identity? The officer looked at me for a moment. Then she said something simple. That would be considered falsification of an internal report. She paused. And depending on intent, it could be treated as misconduct. I nodded, thanked her, and ended the meeting. No confrontation, no raised voices. Just clarity. Back at my desk, my coworker, Evan, was laughing with someone from marketing. He looked completely relaxed, completely confident. The fake complaint had worked exactly the way he expected, or at least, he thought it had. He didn't know HR had already noticed the timestamp. He didn't know I had begun documenting everything. And he definitely didn't know that the systems he used every day left behind far more information than he realized. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not my team, not my manager. Silence was still my strongest position. People assume that if you're quiet, you're inactive. But sometimes silence is simply movement that hasn't become visible yet. Over the next few days, small things began happening behind the scenes. HR requested internal server logs. IT pulled metadata from the email. Compliance quietly reviewed workstation access records. None of it involved me directly anymore. The system was now doing what systems are designed to do. Follow evidence. Evan still treated me the same way. Polite, slightly dismissive, casual. Once he even asked if I had heard anything from HR about that strange complaint. I shook my head and said calmly, "No, nothing yet," which was technically true, because by that point, the situation was no longer a complaint. It had become an investigation, and investigations move slowly, quietly, until the moment they don't. The first sign that something had changed was subtle. On Monday afternoon, several meeting invitations appeared across the department calendar. They looked routine, but the attendees were unusual. HR, compliance, and IT security, and Evan. My name wasn't included. That was when I understood the process had moved past me. Once a concern becomes an internal review, the person who reported it usually steps back while the system begins verifying the facts. The atmosphere in the office shifted slightly that week. Nothing dramatic, just quieter hallways, more closed doors, and conversations that stopped when someone new walked by. Most people didn't know what was happening. They just sensed that something was being examined behind the scenes. Evan didn't seem worried at first. One morning, I heard him laugh near the coffee machine. "Another compliance review," he said. "Probably just an audit." That's how most people see the early stages of these things, just meetings and routine questions. 2 days later, IT temporarily restricted several accounts for what they called an access verification. One of them belonged to Evan. He frowned at his screen while trying to log in. "That's strange," he muttered. Someone suggested a password reset, but I noticed something small. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Later that afternoon, his manager asked him to step into a conference room. The door closed. 30 minutes passed, then 40. When Evan finally returned, he packed his laptop into his bag and said he'd finished the day working from home. No one questioned it. But people noticed. Long meetings and quiet departures tend to leave impressions. I continued working as usual. By that point, there was nothing more for me to do. Everything that needed to be documented had already been shared. Now the internal systems and the people responsible for reviewing them were doing their work, slowly, methodically. The next morning when I arrived at the office, Evan's desk was empty, not temporarily empty, completely cleared. And that was when the department finally realized that something serious had been unfolding all along. By the next morning, Evan's desk was empty. His chair was still there. His monitor, too. But everything personal, his mug, notebooks, and photos, was gone. No announcement was made, but people noticed immediately. In offices, news spreads quietly. Sometimes absence speaks louder than explanation. At first, people assumed he was working remotely, but by midday, questions started appearing in low conversations around the department. Our manager eventually gave a careful answer. "Evan is taking time away while HR completes a review." That was all, but in corporate language, that sentence carries weight. Over the next day, HR spoke privately with several employees. Short conversations, simple verification questions, dates, meetings, messages, routine, procedural steps that slowly confirmed the timeline. The key moment remained the same one that started everything. The email that looked like it came from me had been sent while I was sitting in a meeting with multiple witnesses. Once the system logs were reviewed, the explanation became clear. The email had been created from a shared workstation late in the evening and was scheduled to be sent later. But digital systems track more than send times, login records, devices, locations. Once those details lined up, the pattern was undeniable. 2 days later, HR held a short departmental meeting. They didn't share details, they never do. They simply said an internal misconduct review had been completed and appropriate action had been taken. Everyone understood what that meant, work resumed, projects continued. But the lesson had already settled quietly into the room. Some problems cannot be explained away once the facts are visible. A few weeks later, I unexpectedly saw Evan again. It happened at a small cafe near the office. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he nodded. "June." His voice sounded careful. "Evan," I replied. After a short silence, he said quietly, "I know what happened. HR showed me the timeline." He looked down at his coffee. "I didn't realize they could trace everything like that." I answered calmly. "I never accused you directly." "That's the thing," he said. "You didn't need to." He admitted he thought I would either ignore the situation or not notice it at all. "I underestimated you," he said. I simply nodded. A lot of people did. There was no anger in the conversation, just a reflection. Before leaving, he paused at the door and said quietly, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." I nodded once. "Take care, Evan." And that was the last time I ever saw him. After everything ended, life at work returned to normal. New projects started. A new employee eventually filled Evan's desk. The office moved forward the way offices always do. But something had changed inside me. For a long time, I believed staying calm meant staying invisible. That professionalism meant absorbing small moments of disrespect without reacting. But I learned something different. Calm does not mean passive. Silence does not mean weakness. Sometimes silence simply means you're observing long enough to understand the full picture. Gradually, small things began to shift. People asked for my opinion more often in meetings. Managers trusted me with more responsibility on operational projects. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet change in how people saw me. More importantly, it changed how I saw myself. I was still calm, still thoughtful, still someone who preferred listening before speaking. But I no longer confused quietness with invisibility. Looking back, this story was never really about a fake complaint. It was about understanding the difference between silence and surrender. You don't always need to argue loudly to protect the truth. Sometimes the most effective response is simply patience, documentation, and clarity. Facts, when given enough space, tend to reveal themselves. I didn't celebrate the outcome. What I felt most was relief. Relief that I handled the situation in a way I could respect later. Relief that I didn't need to become louder or more aggressive just to be heard. Sometimes the strongest response is simply letting the truth stand on its own. And now I'm curious about something. Have you ever experienced a moment where someone underestimated you and later realized they were completely wrong? I'd really like to hear your story.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.